Hola, muchachos y muchachas. Just kidding, that's all I know, but I love it. This is part 2 of the brake pads and rotor replacement on a 07 Yukon. This will be the same for many makes and models such as the Cadillac Escalade, Chevy Avalanche, Chevy Silverado, Chevy Suburban, Chevy Tahoe, GMC Sierra, GMC Yukon, and the Yukon XL. In this video, I'm going to tell you what tools we are using, show you what parts that you're going to need, and give you the brake specifications on torque specs. So you might be wondering, how do I get the torque specs? Let me show you. Ha! This here, the Motor Guide book for brake specification. This is a very helpful book. Lets me know the torque specifications on most vehicles. I've got a few of these books. They're bigger yellow books and the brake books. I love Motor Guide books, and I believe Matco bought them, so it says Matco on these now. So those will be also in the description below if you need one of these books. If you're working on a vehicle that is similar to what I am showing you in this video and you think the brake specifications might be a little bit different, make sure you comment below and I will let you know the actual brake specs or torque specs on that vehicle as well. If this video does help you out, comment below with the year, make, model of the vehicle that it did help you on. Like, subscribe, and share while you're watching. Look for helpful links below. Let's get going. You can see we already got started cleaning off the hub surface on this vehicle. It is a good time to check and make sure your hub and your bearing is good while you are here, because if it is bad, you might as well spend the extra 20 minutes and remove the 3 bolts on the back side of your spindle right now and just replace this hub. Super fast on that one too. So get your hub surface really clean. I'm using a wire brush right here. It took me a few minutes, and thank God to editing, I'm gonna cut a lot of it out, but just make sure it's a nice smooth surface before you put your rotor on. Once you get it all clean, you think it's nice and smooth, it's satisfactory to you, grab your rotor, your new rotor, slap that on the hub assembly right here, and I like to use one lug nut to hold the rotor in place while I reassemble everything. It makes it much easier so it doesn't wobble around while I'm trying to put the brake pads on or put the caliper on or anything like that. So I recommend using one lug nut on the rotor to hold everything in place while you're doing the reassembly process. We will go through all of the torque specifications when we tighten everything down, such as the bracket that we're going to put on right now. But before we put the bracket onto the spindle, I like to clean everything off, or at least clean the area where the new hardware kit is going to lay on the bracket itself. Make sure there's no grime under there. Make sure that hardware kit's going to sit flush on the bracket. Now put the bracket over the rotor onto the spindle itself. Grab your bolts, get them started finger tight. Find your 1/2-inch socket wrench and just snug them up. Don't go too tight, even though you're probably not going to go all the way down to torque specifications if you have your torque wrench. We're going to get to that very shortly. These bolts again are a 18mm bolt head. I'm using a deep socket, but a shallow socket would suffice if you have one of those right now. And you can see I like a weird angle. I have to become a contortionist to make a good video for you guys. And hey, I don't always do the best videos, so make sure you like, subscribe, and share too. Let me know what I did right. Let me know what I did wrong in these videos. When we do assemble everything, it is really important to have everything cleaned up while installing it, like with that wire brush, and we're going to clean up the slider pins really soon. It makes for a really good BJ and everything to last the longest it can. With the caliper bracket bolts snugged up, grab your 1/2-inch torque wrench, and we're going to torque these 18mm bolts down to 148 foot-pounds. That's pretty tight. So 148 foot-pounds again. I prefer using a 6-point socket if I can, and again, a shallow socket would suffice at this point if that's all you have, or a deep socket, it doesn't really matter. 148 foot-pounds, one more time. Tighten them both up. Go to the first click on your torque wrench. I used to go to 1 or 2 clicks, and I got a lot of complaints where people would say that second click might be when the bolt is actually going to snap. So I took that in consideration and started only going to that first click when I used my torque wrench. Now we're going to remove the slider pins, but these slider pins were pretty seized when I was trying to take them out. You can see they didn't slide right out like they should have, such as the name slider pins. These ones were really seized. I ended up needing to get a pair of vice grips to latch onto them and rip them out of there. After I did get both of the slider pins out, I ended up using some brake clean, a wire brush, and everything to clean them out really good. These things should not take this effort to remove these. And that's one thing that makes for a good brake job, is having everything really clean, everything properly lubricated, so that the brake parts actually move when you press on the brakes and depress the brakes, that the brake pads come off of the brake pads. That's what the important thing of being or performing a good BJ is, having all of these parts moving properly. And when you're doing this process at home, it should take you about hour and a half to get both sides done, maybe 2 hours. It doesn't take too long to do this process. If you watch part 1 and then here part 2, you have all this knowledge, you have all your parts, you have all your tools. It shouldn't take you too long to get this brake job done. And you can see I sprayed that brake clean into the bracket, and then I put the sliders in, slid them in and out, and that was just to get some of the brake clean on both sides, one in the bracket and then also on the slider pins themselves. Let them set and absorb some of that brake cleaner acetone. I grabbed my little pipe cleaner right here, my little tweaker tool. Love these things. There will be links for these in the description too. Jammed those in the sliders, got them really cleaned out. I got my air tool right here, and I blew all of the excess brake clean that was in there, blew it all out. And also with the acetone, if you blow some air in there, it'll evaporate really, really quick, so you don't contaminate the new lube that you're going to be putting in very shortly. So now that these slider holes are nice and cleaned out, I grabbed a wire brush and cleaned off the actual slider pins themselves. There was a lot of gunk built up on these, and they were really hard to get cleaned off. But again, thanks to editing, I was able to get some of that out of here and speed up the process for you. But you can see, sliding the slider pins on this wire brush, I was able to get all of the gunk off. You had to spray it again with some brake cleaner, but you want to make sure these are really, really clean before you reassemble everything. If you were to take this brake job to a shop, you'd be paying somewhere around $350 to $400, I would expect, to get this job done. So you do save a lot of money doing it at home. I have this high temperature brake grease. It's ceramic brake grease. I've been using it for the past few months. I haven't had any complaints, and it seems to work way better than the older silicone grease that I was using. I found out over time, and that's what was used on these calipers back at 80,000 miles or 70,000 miles when they were replaced or the brakes were done. I used some silicone high temp brake grease, but it seemed to not last as good or be as good as this ceramic stuff. So I'm trying new stuff as the technology advances or changes. It hopefully gets better with time. This stuff, there will be links in the description below for that, such as everything else. I know you guys don't like to be told that all the time, but I love to remind you guys. And also, not everybody stays throughout the whole video, so I got to remind you guys periodically of what's going on. To like, subscribe, and share. Look for links in the description, all that good stuff. Let's get everything lubed up real good. Liberally lube all these sliders up. Make sure they slide in and out of the caliper before you put the actual caliper onto the bracket. So get them in there, jam them in and out a few times, 10, 20 times, whatever you want to do. Just make sure that your slider pins actually slide. When you let off the brakes, these slider pins should move and allow the piston to decompress off of the rotor itself, so you don't have excessive wear on the brake pads. If you have a sticky caliper, your inboard brake pad seems to wear a lot faster than not. So make sure everything's lubricated. I'm not sure if I told you guys. Make sure everything's properly lubricated. I don't like to lubricate the hardware kit. Some people like to lubricate the ears of the brake pads when they're doing their brake jobs. That's not me. I think if you're using a new hardware kit and the manufacturer doesn't recommend it or specifically recommend lubricating the ears when you put your new hardware kit on, don't do it. You can see this brake pad set does have a new hardware kit included. The new hardware kit will clip right into the slots on the bracket itself. You could load the silencers, shims, hardware, whatever you want to call it, into the caliper bracket before you put it onto the actual rotor and the spindle. I, for some reason, just did it at this point in the process. Now grab your new pads. When you grab the pads, make sure you install the inboard pad on the inboard side and the outboard pad on the outboard side. I do like to take a lot of pictures if I'm not making a video as I go along, just so if I get to a point in the process of reassembly. I'm like, what went where? I have pictures of everything. And also, when you put the brake pads back in, or when you reassemble anything automotive wise, if it isn't easy to go in or back together, there is probably something not right, and something is binding or something. You can see that first time I tried to put it on, it just didn't slide into place properly. The second time, they slapped right in. I didn't have any problems. With both brake pads in the caliper, they're both moving easily, no lube on the ears. Let's go ahead and grab the caliper itself hanging on that S-hook up on the spring over there. I still have the caliper compressor loaded inside this caliper, and that was just in case for somehow anybody touched the brake pedal, it wouldn't push the pistons out of the caliper and do more damage. You don't have to do that, and really you could compress the pistons back into the caliper at this time, rather than doing it when I disassembled everything. So if you watch part 1 and part 2, that's just a couple things that you might take in consideration when you do your brake job. Make sure you take lots of pictures though. I really recommend taking lots and lots of pictures. This caliper compressor, my favorite tool, one of my favorite caliper compressors, if not the of my favorite caliper compressors, is going to be in the description below as well, just like all the other tools and parts in this video. Get everything to line up properly. If it doesn't slide into place, if you're having problems putting it onto the actual pads, make sure you're not hitting the pads or the silencers on the back side of the pads. You might knock one of those off and not notice it while you're doing this brake job, and you get a squeaking or a squeal or just a grinding sound because you accidentally pushed the silencer or the shims on the back side of the pads into the rotor, and when you start driving it's like you don't want to do that. Tighten up your caliper to bracket bolts. So this is going to be your caliper to slider bolts actually. These are actually pretty tight for calipers. These are probably the tightest caliper torque specs I've seen on any brakes is on these Chevy SUVs and trucks and whatnot. Snug up the caliper to slider pin bolts using your 1/2-inch socket wrench. Just go a little snug tight. We're going to use the 1/2-inch torque wrench to tighten these down properly. You don't want to over tighten these. You don't want to over tighten anything in the brake system. If you don't have a torque wrench, a lot of people ask me if they could do their brakes. Of course you can, but you do take the chance of over tightening and just something not moving properly. And don't we all love German torque specs of good and tight? I got that 1/2-inch torque wrench in my hand. I have to adjust it down to 74 foot-pounds from the 148 that the caliper bracket to spindle. So the caliper to slider bolts are going to be 74 foot-pounds, 19 millimeter. You might have to use a crescent wrench or a wrench to actually hold the slider pin when you're tightening it down. I didn't need that in this process. When tightening down the caliper to slider pins, make sure you go to that first click on your torque wrench. Again, you don't want to go to the second or third click, just in case those are going to be the clicks that's going to snap the bolt. I've never had that happen, and like I said earlier, I used to go to the second and third click or go back a couple times just to make sure I was getting to the proper torque specifications a couple times before I moved on, but that seemed to be a bad idea. Make sure you take off that lug nut, and if you have a centric ring like this vehicle does, slap that on there as well. Put the wheel on, tighten everything up in a star torque sequence. Don't go in a circle torque sequence. That might make the actual wheel go on a little crooked and cause some wobbling or vibration down the road. After you get your wheel on, you're not done. Don't think you're done yet. Now, you're going to have to get in the cab after the wheel's done, press on the brake pedal, maybe about 5 times. Just press on it until you get a nice firm brake pedal. When you get your firm brake pedal, get about 3 pumps into that. Just make sure it's nice and firm before you go too far. Now, you think you're done? Nope. Don't forget about checking the level in your brake fluid reservoir and make sure the cap is back on the brake fluid reservoir. Now you're pretty much done. Make sure you look in the video library for a ton of helpful videos on this vehicle. I'm coming out with the rear brakes super soon. These videos take quite a bit to edit. Each one of these videos, it took me about an hour to shoot the videos themselves. It takes me about 4 or 5 hours to edit them up and get everything going. So the rear brakes coming out soon. I have some emissions locations on this one coming out soon. Helpful videos. Check out the video library, tell everybody about Scotty's Hobbies, and I'll see you on the next hopefully helpful video.